He's Mick Harrison, and I'm grateful that he has joined us on New Year's Day. Happy New Year, Mick. Is it going to be a good new year for the litigation? Tell us what you think is going to happen.
Oh, Happy New Year, George. And I think it's going to be a constructive, positive, progress-oriented 2023. The key at the moment may be the decision we're waiting for from the U.S. Supreme Court. We have a status conference with I don't have a status conference, but the judges are meeting on January 6th to decide whether they're going to take our case. And our case is about some fundamental constitutional rights that have come up, some rights issues that have come up in the 9/11 context. One of which is, do citizens have a right to report a federal crime to a federal grand jury? And that's a right that's been historically recognized even before we had a constitution, came over from England, and it was adopted in the U.S. Constitution as it existed pre-Constitution. And I don't know if you know, George, the background for this Supreme Court case. Shall I give you a bit on that?
Yes, kindly, for the broader audience. Yes, and tell us what federal crime it is that you allege.
Well, the crime that we allege, and in my view, as a public interest lawyer of 30 years, in my view that we have proven, is a bombing crime. It's a crime that involves use of explosives at the World Trade Center on 9/11, which explains the complete collapse of 3 World Trade Center buildings on 9/11, which pretty much everyone has seen on television by now, if only in a replay. And if you watch those collapses, they look a lot like what's called a controlled demolition in industry, where you use explosives to bring buildings down. A lot of folks don't know yet, some of your listeners may not know, George, that the third skyscraper that fell on 9/11 was Building 7. It was not hit by an airplane. The other 2 towers, everyone knows, was hit by an airplane. Some people dispute that. I don't, and my organization does not. But what we dispute is the reason the buildings fell down. And if you look at our petition to the grand jury, which we gave to the U.S. Attorney in New York, it goes through eyewitness testimony of first responders, trained professionals, firefighters, police, and so forth, these folks reported sights and sounds of explosions on 9/11. It goes through the finding from laboratory analysis of the World Trade Center dust, which shows explosives, high-tech explosives in the World Trade Center dust, a number of other anomalies that have been documented, even documented by government studies, that show there had to be extreme temperatures at the Trade Center on 9/11, which in fact were measured on 9/11. When I say extreme, George, I mean very high temperatures, much higher than jet fuel can create, much higher than building contents create when they burn. So, but even though we felt like that evidence was dispositive on the issue of use of explosives, when we submitted our petition, we were just asking the U.S. Attorney to deliver it, meaning to hand it to the grand jurors so they could make up their own mind. It's sort of like you said at the beginning. We should keep an open mind. Sometimes conspiracies turn out to be real, sometimes not. It depends on the evidence. And my organization is a follow the evidence, follow the law organization. We don't have any time to be dealing with, unsupported allegations, speculation. We're just looking at hard evidence, scientific evidence, eyewitness testimony, the things lawyers normally look at. And so we just asked the U.S. Attorney to give the evidence, which is a 50-some page detailed petition, 50-some exhibits with the scientific evidence and the eyewitness testimony, just hand it to the grand jury. Let the grand jury decide what it thinks about this evidence. And you might be surprised to learn what the U.S. Attorney did with that, particularly given that there's a federal statute in our country that says that U.S. attorneys have a mandatory, emphasize the word mandatory, duty to deliver citizen reports of federal crimes to a federal grand jury, particularly a special grand jury, which is the case here. So what the U.S. Attorney did was they didn't deliver our petition to the grand jury. They may have told the grand jurors that the lawyers committee reported a crime. They might have named the crime as bombing at the World Trade Center, but they did not give our petition with all the evidence to the grand jurors. So we sued the U.S. Attorney in federal court to enforce that mandatory duty And all we were asking wasn't for anyone to agree with our conclusions. We just wanted the law enforced that says the U.S. attorney must hand over the citizen report of a crime to the grand jury. Surprisingly, the district court decided that not only my organization, but another organization, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a nonprofit as well as mine, and family members who lost family members on 9/11, and first responders, some of whom were our co-plaintiffs, that none of us had legal standing to ask the court to decide the question. And so the question didn't get decided. So even though neither court, the district court or the Court of Appeals, disputed the mandatory duty in the statute, they basically said we don't have a right to enforce it because none of us have legal standing. And of course, our question was, well, if family members of victims don't have standing and if first responders don't have standing, who the heck has standing in this country? And yeah, in our view, nobody would. So the Second Circuit, the second highest court in this country, decided our case on appeal, and they unfortunately decided to agree with the district court that we didn't have standing to enforce the duty. And they went beyond that to do some fairly disturbing things. What the Court of Appeals said basically is it's up to the U.S. attorney solely to decide what the grand jury gets to see. Now, for those who studied the U.S. Constitution, you know that the grand jury is a constitutional entity independent of the other three branches. It's its own fixture of the federal government. The Constitution creates it that way. So it's not beholden to the Department of Justice or the executive branch. It's not beholden to Congress or even the courts. The grand jury has a lot of power and independence, at least as it was created. If you look at the Second Circuit decision, if it isn't reversed by the Supreme Court, as we're asking, we're going to be in some difficult times here because the independence of the grand jury may have effectively been eliminated by this decision. And what that means is, and I expect you know this, George, that the grand jury was intended initially to protect citizens from political prosecutions by a rogue government or rogue government officials. So they just wouldn't go after their political adversaries and put them in jail on some false trumped up charge. Grand juries are supposed to protect against that. You can't get an indictment without a grand jury signing off on it. That's an important protection. But if the grand jury only gets to see the evidence that the U.S. attorney wants the grand jury to see, the grand jury isn't independent at all. It's just going to be a handmaiden to the Department of Justice.
Well, look, Mick, you've certainly persuaded me a very somber resume of what would appear on the face of it to be a ludicrous contention that you don't have standing if, as you say, a family member bereaved by 9/11 has no legal standing to advance this petition. Who does? The answer would have to be nobody does. Only the government does, which, as you say, renders the grand jury process null and void. If the Supreme Court means anything, if the word supreme means anything, you might get some relief there, no?
We hope to. And that's the way the system is supposed to work. The Supreme Court is supposed to be the ultimate defender of the Constitution. And there's an even more fundamental problem with the Second Circuit decision on the standing issue in this case. And that is, it wasn't just that the Second Circuit decided we didn't have standing to enforce the statutory duty on the U.S. attorney to report the crimes to the grand jury. Disturbingly, the Second Circuit also decided that our right to submit a petition to any branch of the federal government under the First Amendment, the right to petition for redress, didn't give us standing to complain that the Department of Justice interfered with our right to petition. And it did so because it blocked the delivery of our petition to the government entity for which it was intended, the grand jury. And
that's what's called a catch-22, isn't it?
Pretty close. There's no way out the way the Second Circuit drafted it. Citizens are never going to get their their evidence in front of a grand jury under the Second Circuit's view, unless the U.S. attorney wants the grand jury to see it, which means it supports whatever political position the U.S. attorney is taking at the moment, which is what we're supposed to be avoiding by grand juries. So in this country, for decades, the Supreme Court has been very clear: when a constitutional right is violated, the victim of the violation, whether it's First Amendment or Fifth Amendment or any right, has the ability to go into federal court and ask the court for a remedy and to order the violation corrected. That might seem like, obvious and necessary law to enforce the constitutional rights, and it has been for decades in this country until now. And the Second Circuit decided that even though we were exercising a First Amendment right, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Even though we asserted we were exercising a First Amendment right, the Second Circuit essentially said there is no right under the First Amendment to petition a grand jury, even though it's an entity of the federal government. So, yeah.
You could be forgiven, Mick, for becoming disheartened on this. And yet, as I said in my introduction, I'm going to infer that you are, roughly speaking, my age, not that much younger, in which case, if I'm right, you have seen a situation where the official story about Jack Kennedy's murder has fallen apart to such an extent that it isn't even news anymore when someone like Tucker Carlson, with great eloquence and power, accuses to camera the American government themselves of having killed their own president. So it's the monolith that you're describing as the U.S. attorney will not be a monolith forever, perhaps.
Well, we're not giving up on the fight to enforce the Constitution and change, how shall I say, the politics that have created this problem. The problem you articulate, and Tucker is a little late to the game on the JFK assassination, which has been, a subject of citizen concerns for decades in this country. A lot of evidence to support that position. I personally, unfortunately, agree that the evidence points to a conspiracy. Congress actually found there was a conspiracy in that assassination. A lot of folks forget that. My organization is focused on 9/11 issues, so we haven't taken a position on JFK. But here's the problem. It's not just, 9/11, and it's not just the anthrax attacks which followed 9/11, which a lot of folks have forgotten about, which also brought more fuel to the fire for the war machine to go to the endless war on terror. There have been a number of instances of violence used against the government and government officials in the United States. Assassinations come to mind, but they're not the only instances. The anthrax attacks were another example. 2 weeks after 9/11, anthrax, a bioweapon, was sent through the mail, and the targets of those mailings included 2 U.S. senators, and those 2 U.S. senators happened to be the ones holding up the rushed passage of the Patriot Act. And they almost were assassinated. Fortunately, they were not by those anthrax letters. So, and, there are some other examples. My organization isn't addressing them yet, so I won't talk about them in the moment. But let me just say there's a pattern here of unremedied, unprosecuted, violent crimes against the government and government officials in the United States. 9/11 is part of that pattern. JFK is part of that pattern. There are folks out there that if they don't get their way, they think still that might makes right, and they can use violence to get their way, including in the United States.
Perhaps particularly in the United States, but that's for another day. My last point, Mick, and I'm grateful for your time. The JFK murder was, for me personally, as a person of Irish Catholic background who loved JFK, was of very great significance. But 9/11 is of far greater significance. The killing of Kennedy did not lead to war throughout the world. 9/11 did lead to war throughout the world, which continues to this day. It led to the war on terror, which led to the rise of ISIS, the strengthening of Al-Qaeda, the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism. It led to terrorism exploding all over the world. It led to the reduction in liberty in your own country and in mine. It could not be exaggerated, the impact of 9/11. And therefore, if it turned out to be that 9/11 is not the story we think it is, it's incalculable what the impact of that would be, isn't it, Mick?
Well, it is. You stated it very articulately, George, and I agree with everything you just said. The problem is that there's a lot of evidence out there. Some of it's in our petition, a lot of it, but we're not the only ones putting this evidence out there. A lot of scientists, engineers, architects, other lawyers, other advocates have for years. And that evidence creates, at a minimum, a legitimate fact question about what happened on 9/11 that's never been investigated by any government entity. And even if you don't agree with our petition and our position that the evidence scientifically is dispositive, and we think it is, it's one of those Sherlock Holmes things where, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth. Well, the scientific evidence eliminates everything else. So explosives, incendiaries had to be used. So the question is so huge, as you stated correctly, that even if there's only a doubt that we might be right, the grand jury needs to see this evidence and decide for themselves. Congress needs to do its own investigation, which it's never fully done. And, the worst case here is pretty severe, the worst possible case. And it deserves an investigation that is equal to the severity of the problem that you have articulated.
Mick, Ice Fury, one of our viewers, asks, are there any high-ranking, standing or retired military officers, New York firefighters, or NYPD who would join this petition?
I think the answer to that is yes, in regard to high-level military, although to my knowledge, none have done so yet. We do have some firefighters, New York firefighters, who joined our petition already. One of them was a fire
and
commissioner.
Police officers also?
Let me think about that. Possibly.
Sorry,
we have.
You were telling me about the fire commissioner.
And the fire commissioner, Chris Joya, is actually one of the co-plaintiffs in the case that's now in front of the Supreme Court. So he was there responding after the attacks at Ground Zero, as were his colleagues. He lost a lot of friends, as many folks did, in those attacks. And he has had the courage to speak out on the issue and has joined our litigation. I'm very honored to consider Chris my friend and colleague at the moment. There are a lot of firefighters who are concerned. A lot of your listeners may not know that the fire department in New York took testimony from over 100 firefighters, I forget the exact number, after 9/11 to preserve their testimony. And the testimony was preserved, but it wasn't released. And then the New York Times sued under the Freedom of Information Act and acquired all those first responder testimonies, and they're now available if you know how to find it on the New York Times website. And a lot of those folks say, I saw what looked like an explosion. I heard sounds that looked like an explosion. Some of them even said, it looks like what you see on television in a controlled demolition. Some of the firefighters said that as their impression in the moment as they watched the collapse of the buildings. That's, in a normal case that wasn't politicized, that would be pretty significant evidence of a bombing crime.
Well, look, Mick, thanks. When you get the result, we'll return to it. When do you expect to hear the Supreme Court decision?
Well, we're hoping in January. The Supreme Court, of course, follows their own schedule, not mine. And they're meeting January 6th to discuss the case, and I'm sure a number of other cases. I expect after they do the discussion, it won't take them long to make the decision. But it's possible the Supreme Court may invite the government to respond to our petition, which has not happened yet. The government declined initially to respond. So if the government decides to respond, that may take an additional few months.
January 6th, an auspicious date last year, and this. Thank you very much indeed, Mick Harrison of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth. I don't know about you, I actually find that a very fascinating treatise on a subject that might very well become the biggest subject on the planet.